Was footwear predisposing for lower extremity injuries in runners and walkers, a prospective study. Please welcome Sophie.
Thank you. Well, yeah, first of all, I would like to apologize. My colleague Tina Willems couldn't make it, so I'll try to represent it instead of her as good as possible. I have to acknowledge she did a major part of the work, but of course I wasn't involved in the thing. So up till now we've heard all possible effects of shoes causing injuries and perception of shoes once they have the shoes, but we actually took it a step back and were wondering if the decision to buy which shoe might be actually already a risk factor at stake. I'm not telling anything new, especially to this group, if I'm saying that when a sports person wants to go out and buy a new pair of shoes, he's overwhelmed by the choices out there. How do you pick the right shoe out of the amount of shoes you see on the shelf in a store? And if we look at the advertisements coming with that, they're very promising. Either they promise that we'll have better performance in like running faster, running further, or that they will help in reducing the risk of injuries, or that they will try to help us to get less fatigue or less fast fatigue while performing. But even though all those promising ads, we still have to admit, and that's been said here a couple times today, there's still a lot of running injuries, running or walking, because we looked at both injuries out there, even with all the possible good effects that the shoes promise us. So to take it a step backwards, we looked at consumers' behavior, what helps us to make a decision in which shoe we want to buy, and then we actually split that up into basic groups of criteria that help to make us a decision. The one group is the basic decisions, and those are actually the decisions you make even before you go out to the store. So when you find the reason or that it's time to buy a new pair of shoes, before you most likely will decide what store you will go to, for instance, you will before decide whether you go for a gait analysis to get advice on the proper shoe or not. So those we call, or not we, but are called the basic decisions. And then in the second group, there's the influencing factors, and those are actually the criteria that help you determine the final choice on the spot once you are in the store. And those include like color, model, and material. We'll see a few more coming up later. And so up to now, as far as we know, there's little knowledge about the relationship between the behavior and how to make the choice and the possible effect of risk injuries. So we were actually questioning, although we know that, of course, the etiology of lower extremity injuries is multifactorial and very well, we were wondering if that consumer behavior and the criteria in there might contribute to the risk of developing a lower extremity injury. So we went to different running and gaits events and approached possible participants, and we found 300 runners and 280 walkers initially agreeing to participate in the study. So from those people we have baseline questionnaires, and the baseline questionnaire consisted out of 28 questions. Part of them were looking for information on the basic decisions, and the other half, well not really half of it, the other part of the questionnaire was looking for information on the influencing factors. Then they were followed up for 6 months. It was a prospective study, and we followed them up by 2 weekly questionnaires about injuries. The injuries were self-reported, but to be taken into account as an injury for this study, they had to fulfill a few criteria. The injury had to be at a muscle, joint, tendon, or bone at the lower extremity. It had to be attributed, so the runner or the walker had to say, yes, it is from running and walking, not occurring during some other activity they did, or due to some accidental trauma in between. The injury had to lead to influence the running or the walking, so they had to either lead to reduction in distance or speed, or in the frequency or in the duration of each sports activity. And of course, if it led to treatment of the injury, it would also include it as an injury. Statistics to look at all that, we use univariate binary logistic regression to identify the risk factors for an injury in the lower extremity in the consumer behavior. Now, taking us to the results from the big group we had in the beginning, we ended up with 104 runners and 104 walkers completing the injury questionnaires over the full 6 months, and still using the same shoes at the end of the 6 months. The same shoes, meaning the shoes that we at baseline questioned about how they came to the decision to buy that particular pair of shoes. The ones that changed in between 6 months were excluded for analysis. And so from those 208 people, we ended up with 49 injuries. 70% of those ended to be up in the runners, about 30% of those ended to be up in the walker group, and in accordance with what's been said before here today, the majority of those were localized in knee and lower leg. Now looking at the risk factors and protective factors, nothing very surprising when we look at the protective factors. It's been mentioned here this morning as well. If you use a sport-specific shoe, that helps to protect for injuries. Also, if you buy the correct size, is a protection factor. Now looking at the risk factors, there were some that we were not that surprised with. We really worried about the price-quality ratio as a negative influence or can be a risk factor if you don't care for the model or for the closure mechanism. So if it doesn't matter whether it's shoelaces or it's Velcro strips, if it just doesn't matter whatever I find on that day, we can live with it. What was more surprising to us and what we didn't really expect to be a risk factor was the people that underwent the gait analysis before the buying the shoe came out as a real risk factor in the end. Now why that is today, I cannot really give you an answer. As I said, we were surprised and puzzled with it. We have two hypotheses which we will have to test in the future or go back to the people that participated to find out more about history. One hypothesis we have about that being a risk factor is that maybe the people that underwent the gait analysis feel protected by the shoe they bought. They base their feelings on the fact that they were advised and that they were told that that was the best shoe for them. And maybe feeling protected by the shoe, they're less careless about, or they're more careless about their running program, about their training program. They don't, we don't know, we're just speculating about that, but that they don't care that much about it because they do feel protected with the shoe. Or the other hypothesis, and then it's a pity that we didn't question about history, but that was not included in the questionnaire there. Maybe it's the people that had running injuries before, those might be the ones opting for a gait analysis before going to buy a new pair of shoes. And if that is the case, then maybe it's the history of an old injury, walking or running injury, which is the main risk factor rather than the fact that they had the gait analysis. So that's something we have to dig in further, and we're really intrigued by to figure out there what might be the cause of that. For protective measures, we know that the model, the sport specifically, the closure mechanism and correct size are important. So we do feel that health professionals like physical therapists, podiatrists should really help patients and sports people to guide them and to advise them about those things, that those are the factors they really should take into account when they are at the point of buying new shoes and deciding which pair of shoes they might want to get for their future sport activities. So thank you for listening, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have.
Open up the floor for questions.
Thank you, Sophie, for the interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you have any further information regarding the gait analysis, because it can be anything from somebody filming you with his iPhone to a sophisticated 3D kinematic and kinetic analysis, and also the personnel that is performing the interpretation of the results can be very different with their experience and background.
No, very correct point. No, we don't have that information, and as you say, it might be that they had, due to earlier problems that they had, like more in a medical setting where somebody really trained in such a gait analysis might have done a more extended analysis, whereas there's a lot of stores, at least in Belgium, but I assume all over the world, where there are people that are selling the shoes, doing a quick gait analysis, putting them on a treadmill, quickly look at the video or so, and they give the advice to shoes. So that might be one of the things we have to look into as well, if that's the factor that is influencing it. We're not sure about that. Thanks.
Really interesting presentation. Did you have a look in your binary logistic regressions to find out how much of the variation is actually explained by each of the predictor variables?
I'm really sure Tina did that because she did the statistics, so I'm not going to answer that, not trying to make a mistake, but if you want to, I can get it to you back later on if I check with her.
Just what makes it we go back to the CAD analysis because technical retail is so dependent on the CAD analysis at the moment. Just some of your results here then maybe that is the wrong way potentially to be doing things. You know, are we overcomplicating this process for our runners?
Maybe we are, and as we've heard this morning, we've been looking at the information and questioning for so long, and we all question if we are looking at the right parameters. So especially then in those maybe less sophisticated running analyzers in a store, that's especially the things they will be looking at. So maybe we're just indeed overcomplicating it or looking at the wrong parameters to recommend the right shoe for the person.
All right, so we'll think Sophia. Paper called Footwear Comfort and the Variability of Running Kinematics.
High footwear comfort is one of the most important features of a running shoe. Previous studies have shown measurable benefits of high perceived comfort for runners, such as improvement in running economy, as well as the reduction in movement-related injuries. However, it is currently unknown by which mechanism these benefits may occur. One reason for that is that it is generally not well understood how perceived comfort affects the running movement. Previous investigators who have looked into the relationship between perceived comfort and the running movement in terms of some traditional kinematic variables have found no systematic relationship between the two. However, in the field of ergonomics, previous studies have reported a relationship between perceived discomfort while doing a task and the movement variability of task execution. Based on these findings, we hypothesized that there would be a similar relationship when we're looking at the perceived footwear comfort and the variability of running kinematics. Therefore, the objective of this study was to investigate the relationship between perceived comfort of running footwear and the variability of running kinematics. 36 recreational runners between the ages of 18 to 40 were recruited for the study and tested in 5 different running shoes. In each of the 5 shoes, the runners ran 3 times for 60 meters at a speed of about 3.5 meters per second. And we performed 2 comfort assessments to obtain a reliable assessment of the subject's shoe preferences. The average comfort scores were then further used for this analysis. During the second assessment, we also assessed running kinematics in each of the 5 shoe conditions. Now here you can see the 5 shoe conditions. 4 of them are running shoes and 1 of them was a training shoe that are currently on the market. Different runners like different shoes. Therefore, those shoes were selected to cover a wide range in midsole properties, pronation support, and in weight to be able to provide a more or less comfortable solution for every individual runner. Running kinematics were collected using an inertial measurement unit that was mounted onto the dorsum of the shoe and securely taped to prevent any movement between the sensor and the shoe. These IMUs collected 3-dimensional accelerations and 3-dimensional angular velocities at a sampling rate of 250 Hertz. After the detection of the heel strikes, the IMU data was time normalized to the duration of the gait cycle, and then for each condition we overlaid 45 strides. This
graph shows an example for 45 strides for one subject and one condition, and you can see the acceleration of the IMU sensor along the z-axis of the sensor. 0 represents field strike, and 100% represents the next field strike. Well, for this subject, the toe-up occurred about 35% into the gate cycle. To now determine the variability of those signals, we calculated the mean and the standard deviation across 45 strides for each time point during the gate cycle. And the mean of those curves is represented in green, while the standard deviation is represented in red. Now, if we inspect the standard deviation signal a little bit more, you can see that there are two peaks, one around the heel strike and one around the toe-up. These high moments of a high standard deviation represented artificial variability that were induced by noise from the IMU sensors. In order to prevent including this artificial variability into our analysis, we decided to only look at the swing phase of running, which we selected as 50 to 95% of the gate cycle. Our relative variability measure as our outcome measure was then determined as the root mean squared standard deviation divided by the root mean squared mean in this time period between 50 to 95% of the gate cycle. Now, this measure has the advantage that it can be compared between different subjects, but also between different sensor outputs of different magnitude. Both comfort assessments consisted in a comfort rating on a 10 centimeter visual analog scale, as well as in a ranking of the 5 shoes in terms of the perceived comfort. For each individual subject, the most comfortable shoe was selected as a shoe that received the highest average rank across the 2 comfort assessments that we obtained, as well as the least comfortable shoe was selected as the shoe with the lowest average rank. The VAS data was then used as a tiebreaker for equal ranks and to confirm that we were dealing with real comfort changes. Using this methodology, this table shows the number of times each of the shoes was selected as most comfortable or least comfortable. And as you can see, all of the 5 shoes were well represented both as most comfortable or least comfortable by different subjects, which once again confirms subject individual preference. This result is also important because it shows us that if we do find a relationship between variability and comfort, it is actually an isolated comfort effect and not a shoe-specific effect due to certain construction features. This next graph shows the average comfort scores on the VAS scale for the most comfortable and the least comfortable shoes for all runners. And you can see that there is an average difference of about 4 centimeters between the 2 conditions. Previous studies have shown that a 1 centimeter difference on a 10 centimeter scale represents a clinically meaningful difference in comfort. So this shows that we were dealing with real changes in perceived comfort between the 2 conditions. To now look at the relationship to variability, we looked at the percentage change in relative variability when switching from the most to the least comfortable shoe. Now this graph shows this average percentage change in relative variability for all 36 runners and for 6 sensor outputs, 3 accelerations and 3 angular velocities. A negative percentage change represents the case when the variability was reduced in the least comfortable shoe compared to the most comfortable shoe. And this was the case for 5 out of the 6 sensor outputs, here shown in green. For the angular velocity about the z-axis of the sensor, the relative variability was significantly reduced by 6% in the least comfortable shoe compared to the most comfortable shoe. Now these results suggest that when you switch into a less comfortable shoe, the relative variability of the lower extremity kinematics are reduced. So let's see where this difference could come from. These graphs show an example of the angular velocity about the z-axis of the sensor, which was the variable where the relative variability was reduced in the least comfortable shoe. And these graphs show data from one subject and 45 strides for the most comfortable shoe on the left and the least comfortable shoe on the right. Now you can already see by eye that the waveforms on the left here have a higher variability than the waveforms on the right. And the second observation that you can make is that this difference seems to be most clearly visible towards the end of the stride between 70 to 90% of the gate cycle. Now what this could represent, or what this could mean, is that in a less comfortable shoe, the kinematic pattern becomes more constrained or more repetitive to towards the end of the stride when the runner prepares for the landing or for the heel strike. While these graphs only show results from one subject, this was seen for multiple other subjects as well. So if we come back to our initial hypothesis, this study suggests that yes, there seems to be a relationship between perceived footwear comfort and the variability of running kinematics. To our best knowledge, this is the first study to show a relationship between these two variables. We speculate that a shoe with a higher comfort offers a higher number of comfortable solutions for the runner to execute the running movement, while a shoe with a lower comfort has a lower number of comfortable solutions and therefore constrains the kinematic pattern and makes it more repetitive. A more repetitive and a more constrained kinematic pattern has been mentioned previously as a possible risk factor for overuse injuries during running. In the context of our study's findings, increased variability in shoes with high perceived comfort could be a possible link of the result of the reduction in movement-related injuries. The IMU-based methodology described in this study could be a useful solution to monitor variability in natural running environments, as well as in the store over time, and should be used in future research that explores this possible link between comfort, variability, and injuries. With that, I would like to acknowledge the study team and the funding sources. Thank you.
Really excellent study, but I have a question for you. The 2 points where you showed the increase in variability at touchdown and then when the foot was leaving the ground, and you said that those were the result of the movement of the IMUs. How did you decide on that?
Well, they were not necessarily the result of the movement of the sensors. It was more the result of their high accelerations that occurred during heel strike and during co-op. And at this point in time, we were not comfortable including those in our analysis, but I agree with you that it would be very useful to also include the stance phase in our variability analysis.
Did you ever think that those increases in variability might actually be functional?
Yeah, I think they could be, but I don't know at this point. I know that in some of your previous studies, the biggest difference in variability has been seen around the heel strike. So we hope to include those phases in the future.
Any other questions?
Thank you for this nice presentation. I was wondering if you gave some indication regarding the definition of comfort to the runner, because it's a quite global term, and maybe some runners look at more at the upper features, whereas others more at the midsole features.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. At this point, the data that we have shown is a general assessment of comfort, so we didn't specify any parts of the shoe. But I do agree that probably some people indicated that is a good comfort because of the sole, because of the upper. I think it would be a good way to go about it in the future.
All right, we want to thank our speaker. We're going to welcome our fifth speaker for this session, Jessica Dobson. And Jessica is going to be talking about how do we fit underground coal mining workforce. Please welcome her.
Thank you. During a typical 8 to 12 hour shift, underground coal miners spend a large amount of time on their feet. Just to show this to you visually, we've got percentage of responses of 360 underground coal miners in my local area, and they were asked to rate how many hours they spend either walking, standing or sitting. And as you can see, they typically spend 0 to 2 hours sitting, and as you get more towards this end of the scale, they spend most of their time standing, with some participants even spending the whole of their 12-hour shift standing and walking. So not only are underground coal miners on their feet for long periods of time, but they're working in this unpredictable environment. So the underground coal mine is uneven, it's movable, there's rocks of different sizes, so it's quite challenging for them to work on. As a result, their work footwear not only has to provide protection to the foot, but it also has to provide support, particularly while walking on these uneven surfaces. So it's important that their work footwear fits. When footwear doesn't fit, it leads to foot problems, it leads to pain, not only at the foot, but at the rest of the lower limb. And it affects the mechanical loading, so it affects the way that they move and walk. And for these underground coal miners who are on their feet, having poor fitting footwear is uncomfortable. And so what actually is footwear fit? The simple definition is that the internal shape of the footwear must match the shape of the foot as closely as possible. However, you don't want an exact match. The literature recommends you should leave a 10 to 20 millimetre or a thumb's width gap between the longest toe and the end of the footwear. And then in terms of the breadth, there should be a snug to 20 millimetre gap. So this is relatively vague. What do underground coal miners actually think of the fit of their work boots and consequently their comfort? A large percentage actually rate their work boot fit as reasonable to good. However, in terms of comfort, majority are rating their work boots as uncomfortable to indifferent. There's a large percentage of foot problems, with calluses the most common, and there's a large amount of reported foot and ankle pain. And of those who have reported this pain, 62% believe that their work boots were the main contributing factor. There are also a high incidence of self-reported lower back pain and knee pain. So this raised the question of why overall are underground coal miners saying that their work boots fit, but then they're reporting all these other things that are indicating that their boots may not be fitting. 3D scanning was a way to answer this question, to look at the shape of the underground coal miners' feet relative to the internal shape of their work footwear as a means of identifying mismatching points. Our lab has previously done this study, and we did find mismatching points between the underground coal miners' feet and their work boots. So this is just a visual representation I made in GeoMagic, showing that when the feet were inserted inside the boots, there's coloured areas where the foot would be touching the edge of the boot, and then you can see that it's not wide enough at the front here. So the issue was we found these mismatching points, but then the question arose, what is an appropriate gap? The literature is vague. Also, are there other important areas in regards to fit besides just length and foot breadth? Also, could these gaps be linked to the miner's perceptions of fit and comfort and their reported lower limb pain? This led to the aim of this study, to determine the association between the internal work boot shape, foot shape match and work boot satisfaction in underground coal miners. So we had foot scans of 270 underground coal miners, and I then took the 208 scans in the 4 most common sizes. And from the 3D scans, I extracted 12 dimension measures. So I had a measure of length, then with the toes, toe 1 angle, toe 5 angle, and the height of both those toes. The ball girth circumference, the foot breadth, the height of the ball of the foot. In terms of the instep, had the circumference, the height, and then with the heel, had the breadth and the circumference. I then had the question of creating the internal work boot shape, and I did this using plaster of Paris to create molds. So I made up a mixture of plaster of Paris and water. I then poured these inside the work boots and left them to dry in a climate controlled environment. I then physically cut these molds outside of the boots, and this gave me an internal representation of the underground coal miners' boots. I then scanned this in the same 3D scanner that was used for the feet and created 3D models and extracted those same measurements. And I did this for the 2 most common boots that the underground coal miners wear, which is a gum boot and leather lace-up boot. To then classify work boot satisfaction, we also had surveys. And so I extracted the questions of the miners selected whether they had any foot problems, do they currently get foot or ankle pain, and if so, how often? Also, do they have any of the following lower limb pains? And they were asked to rate work footwear fit and comfort on a scale. So there's a lot of variables here, just to give you a summary. So I had the 3D foot scans. I then had the mould representing the internal work boot shape. I had this in the 4 most common sizes. I extracted these dimension variables from both of those. And I then calculated the difference between the foot and the work boot for each of these variables. And I sorted those into categories. So there was either a 0 to 10 millimetre gap between, say, the end of the toe and the end of the boot. And these were then also classified as a minus, so where the minus feet were smaller than their boots, so there was room inside their boots, or that the minus feet were larger than their boots. So saying to fit inside that boot, they would have to squash their feet. And I then had the surveys, which I was using to classify work boot satisfaction. So I then wanted to see, was there an association between these and work boot satisfaction? So I did this using a chi-squared analysis, which was looking at that difference between the foot and the internal work boot shape and work boot satisfaction. What did I find? The interesting finding was that there was no significant association between the length and breadth variables and whether a miner rated their work boot fit as comfortable or uncomfortable, or whether they listed any of those foot problems. So I'll run through the significant differences I did find. So here's where we've got, again, that difference between the foot and the internal work boot shape. And then these were the variables, so the heel girth circumference, heel breadth, and the ball girth circumference. And the results are interesting in that it showed almost a sort of scale, where when there was a difference of 20 to 30 millimetres between the foot and the boot, the miners were more likely to rate their boots as very comfortable. But as we started to travel further away, where there was a larger difference, you were starting to get those worse perceptions. And a similar finding was with instep height and ball girth height. Got the instep height and ball girth height, where again there was almost this sort of scale where when there was a 10 to 20 millimetre gap here, the miners were less likely to have calluses, less likely to have poor fit, where here 10 to 20 and 20 to 30 look to be more appropriate for them to rate their boots as comfortable. And again, when you're moving outside of these areas, their perceptions were not as good. So particularly here, which makes sense, as the boot was smaller than the foot, and so they're rating it as uncomfortable and a poor fit. Basically, the main take home from this exploratory study is that when fitting underground coal mining work boots, maybe the traditional measurements of length and breadth are not the only way we should be fitting their footwear. We should be looking at other variables, particularly the fit at the heel, the fit at the ball girth, and the fit at the instep. And also from this study, we now have some quantitative variables to guide work boot fit in the future. So hopefully we can then fit underground coal miners in their work boots more appropriately, so we have happier miners. Thank you.
Open the paper up for question. I'm going to start. Miners could be on their feet 8 to 12 hours a day. The fit and the long held assumption that the structural shape of the foot may actually get bigger towards the end of the day. Any perception about how the fit might have actually built a water environment than perhaps being on a work shift? What would be like 8, 10, 12 hours? Because that's still going to get at the end of the day. Any ideas on that?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we're interested in, because the foot does swell over time, particularly when you're on your feet. And these scans were taken before a work shift.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, this study was just to give us a bit of an idea. And so now we'd love to fit miners in boots with those kind of gaps and then get them to wear test it that's over that shift. Get to see if the foot does indeed swell.
Any questions at all?
So what assumptions do you need to make to register the foot with the internal shape of the boot?
So what do you mean?
I guess you could assume that the heels of the foot line up with the internal heel of the shoe, and then you have a gap in the toe. Or maybe they would be standing further up in in the shoe?
Yeah, this is that's kind of the limitation of this study in that we didn't have the foot in the boot. We kind of had them separate. So we can't be 100% sure whether a miner actually had their heel at the back of the boot or whether when they actually wear it, they wear it further. The only thing was we knew what size boot a miner wore, so I was comparing a size 9 foot to a size 9 boot. So it's kind of that was the boot that they say they wear. But we need further testing to actually look at the exact inside.
I want to ask you, why don't you use the last? I mean, why do you use the last directory, but you use the model you made by yourself?
Generally in terms of when manufacturers, they try to keep their last secret, all the measurements, and from previous experience and other research, just getting measurements from the last didn't provide as many dimensions as we were able to extract. So I kind of found that me doing it myself, pouring it in, I could then take a lot more measurements.
Do you get any information on how old the shoes were, or the boots?
These boots were new, so
all of them were.
all of them were new boots, and that's another thing that we would be interested in looking into. In that, obviously these boots haven't been worn in; they were just new ones. But we kind of were happy doing that just because a miner is provided with boots and they're straight out into the field. So we wanted to try and get that match initially.
Well, thank you.